There is a reason television shows such as Unsolved Mysteries featuring Robert Stack and BuzzFeed Unsolved featuring Shane Madej and Ryan Bergara are so popular. As a species, humans are naturally curious, and when something goes unsolved, our curiosity takes over and we just want to solve it. Here in Oregon, we have our share of mysteries. One such takes place in the fall of 1923 at a little place called Lava Lake, Oregon in the Cascade Mountains near Bend, Oregon. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you to lightly knock the dust off the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more Oregon stories and adventures just like this one. Ed Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris decided to spend the winter of 1923 in a cabin near Lava Lake in the Cascade Mountains near Bend, Oregon. There, they planned to do some trapping and work as caretakers for the cabin, which was owned by a logging contractor named Ed Logan from Bend. The men were also tasked with taking care of 5 foxes that were valuable to Ed Logan. They planned to return back to Bend, Oregon in the spring of 1924. The 3 men spent the late fall and winter setting up traps for mink, beaver, and foxes. For the most part, they seemed to have been successful. The week before Christmas in 1923, Ed Nichols visited Bend, Oregon and sold some furs. According to witness statements, he seemed pleased and it appeared as though the venture was being a very successful one. Shortly after Christmas, a man named Alex Wilcox, the owner of a resort near Elk Lake, 6.5 miles north of Lava Lake, traveled by snowshoe from his home in Fall River to his resort in Elk Lake, stopping at the cabin to visit with the men en route. Fall River is approximately 21 miles south of Lava Lake, and snowshoeing would have taken several days. According to him, the 3 men were in good spirits. He left the following morning. That was the last time anyone reported seeing Ed Nichols, Roy Wilson, and Dewey Morris alive. In the early spring of 1924, Dewey Morris's brother Enos became concerned. He hadn't heard from his brother since around Christmas. Enos and Pearl Lenz, who was the superintendent of the Tumalo Fish Hatchery, started feeling suspicious and notified authorities. In April of 1924, a search team was sent to the cabin to investigate. Outside the cabin, a sled used for transport was missing. The pen, which housed Ed Logan's valuable foxes, was empty, and inside was a claw hammer that was covered in blood. Inside the cabin, there was an uneaten meal placed on the table and a pot full of burnt food on the stove. The search team checked the men's traps and found them completely unmaintained. Some of them even had dead animals that were either frozen or decaying. But there was no sign of the 3 men. A day later, Deschutes County Sheriff Samuel E. Roberts and Deputy Sheriff Clarence Adams arrived at the cabin to begin their investigation. Near the shore of Big Lava Lake, investigators found the sled, which was covered in blood. On the lake, it was discovered a hole had been dug into the ice and refrozen. Traces of blood were found in the snow on the trail from the cabin to the lake, as well as clumps of hair and a single human tooth. After the ice from the lake had melted enough so that boats could safely enter the lake, the bodies of all 3 men were found floating in the water. Autopsy showed the 3 men had been beaten and shot. Ed Nichols' jawbone had been completely destroyed by a shotgun and had another gunshot wound, likely from a small caliber revolver, in the back of his head. Dewey Morris had been shot in the left forearm and his skull had been fractured, presumably from the claw hammer that was found in the fox pen. Roy Wilson had a gunshot wound to his right shoulder and another one in the back of his head. Police presumed that the 3 men were inside the cabin and had been lured outside the cabin and ambushed. Very likely, 2 of the men came out first, ambushed. The 3rd man came out to see what the commotion was, and he was also ambushed and killed. There was no traces of blood found inside the cabin, so all 3 men were actually killed outside the cabin. Police came up with a few people of interest quickly, however, they all had solid alibis. It was Ed Logan, the owner of the cabin, who came up with the first suspect, a trapper he knew as Lee Collins, a man described as slow-witted and hot-headed. Nichols and Collins had been trapping and mining partners the year before, but had a falling out. Collins had reportedly told Nichols he was going to kill him during an argument over a stolen wallet. The root of this story is that Collins stole Nichols' wallet and was called out for it. Nichols had asked Morris and Wilson to join him at the cabin because he, quote, feared what would happen if Lee Collins showed up, end quote. Lee Collins' true identity would turn out to be Charles Kimsey, who was wanted for attempted murder of a stagecoach driver whom he threw down a well in Bend. He was charged with the attack but fled before being apprehended. Kimsey also escaped from an Idaho prison and was wanted for murder in Utah, also involving a stagecoach driver. A police officer in Portland, Oregon recognized Kimsey as one of the two men who approached him in late January of 1924 and asked for directions to a fur trader where the two men would sell expensive fox pelts. 5 fox pelts to be exact, the exact same number that was missing from the Lava Lake cabin. The fur trader remembered seeing 2 men. One was friendly, talkative, and very disarming. The other, who he believed was Kimsey, was quiet and shy. Neither the trader or the police officer were able to identify the second man. A $1,500 reward was offered for Kimsey. Kimsey would be apprehended in 1933, 9 years later, near Kalispell, Montana, by an Idaho prison guard who recognized Kimsey. He was returned to Oregon for questioning and identification. However, the fur trader in Portland that Kimsey sold the fox furs to for $115 could not positively identify Kimsey. Too much time had passed. The police officer had passed away a few years before Kimsey had been apprehended. In addition, Kimsey claimed to have an alibi. He stated he was working in Colorado on the Moffat Tunnel. However, this could not be verified. He was charged, tried, and convicted of the attempted murder of the stagecoach driver and was sentenced to life in prison at Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Oregon. This was the maximum and harshest sentence he could receive at the time. He would serve 25 years and was paroled in 1957. As for the murder charge in Utah, the evidence against Kimsey was circumstantial and the charges were never pursued. The state of Idaho also did not pursue charges of his escape after he had served his time in Oregon. While Kimsey had a long history drawing a pattern of violent and threatening behavior, the evidence police had against Kimsey with the murders of Ed Nichols, Dewey Warren, and Roy Wilson was circumstantial and Kimsey was never charged. Charles Kimsey lived the remainder of his life in Idaho without further incidents before dying in the 1970s. But the police believe there was at least 2 people involved in the murders. Who was that second man who was friendly, talkative, and disarming to the fur trader in Portland? Oregon historian Melanie Tupper makes an interesting case in her book, The Trapper Murders. Between 1899 and 1930, there are more than a dozen unsolved murder cases in Central Oregon, not including the Lava Lake murders. And in each and every one of them, the name Ray Van Buren Jackson shows up. He's even been dubbed Central Oregon's Angel of Death. Ray Jackson was a smooth talker. He was friendly and he was outgoing. He was also a very well-known criminal around Oregon. From 1896 to 1898, Jackson had done time in Oregon State Penitentiary for forging payment vouchers. He went back to prison in 1899 for an armed robbery in Baker County. In 1902, after serving 5 years in prison, 2 for forgery and 3 for the robbery, he landed the most unbelievable job a convicted felon could land: a school teacher teaching 1st through 8th grade in Lake County, Oregon. It is unlikely the school district knew of his criminal past. Background checks weren't a thing in the early 1900s in rural Oregon. In his classroom, he was known as a very strict disciplinarian. Jackson kept a few buggy whips, the whips he used on horse-drawn carriages, to steer the animals. He used these whips to beat misbehaving students. He bragged about doing this, and it appeared as though he took pleasure in it. He confided in a neighbor that he brought a Colt single-action revolver to classes as a way to instill and maintain discipline. One of his students barely escaped serious injury when Jackson threw a glass inkwell at him. On April 1st, 1904, one of his students, an 11-year-old girl named Zelma Martin, died after she stayed after school and was alone with Jackson. Her cause of death was ruled as an accidental poisoning. Despite this, and completely unbelievably, he was elected as the Lake County School Superintendent in 1908. But that position only lasted a few years. In 1911, he was charged with embezzlement and resigned his position. Ray Jackson has a very long sociopathic history, often leading to violence. There are way too many details to include in this video. The dozen or so murders he was already connected to outside the Lava Lake murders is a topic for a whole other video. Jackson died in 1938 and his death was ruled a suicide, though there are suspicions surrounding even that. So how does he relate to the murders of Ed Nichols, Dewey Warren, and Roy Wilson? As it would turn out, Ray Van Buren Jackson was a close friend of Charles Kimsey, and he absolutely was in the area at the time of the murder. In addition, in late January of 1924, Jackson was in Portland. This is the same time frame Kimsey was spotted in Portland selling furs. What are the chances? He was never a suspect with investigators, and his connection was only brought to light in 2013, 89 years after the death of Ed Nichols, Dewey Warren, and Roy Wilson. As a result, the Lava Lake murders remain unsolved to this day, and being that it is almost 100 years old, it's unlikely it will ever be solved. Thanks for watching this video. If you know of any more unsolved mysteries in Oregon, please leave a brief description in the comments below, or you can direct message me on Instagram at RV Oregon Trails, link in the description. Thanks for watching.